Okay, so now we're down to our last plenary session, lecture entitled Shared Prosperity Characterized by 4 Development Goals: Proper Growth, Proper Development, Inclusive Growth, and Inclusive Development. To formally introduce our plenary speaker, let me call on the current treasurer of the PES, who is also a professor at the De La Salle University School of Economics, Dr. Marites M. Tionco. Ma'am?
I'll introduce you first. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. As they say, save the best for last. Thank you for staying. So I'm honored to introduce to you one of the acclaimed economic theorists of all times, Dr. Nanak Kakwani, as speaker for the 61st PES Conference Closing Plenary Session. So Dr. Kakwani was appointed Distinguished Fellow of the Gulati Institute of Finance and Taxation in India in September 2021. He has been a visiting professor of economics at the China Institute for Income Distribution in Beijing Normal University in China. He was also professor of economics and head of the Department of Econometrics for 30 years at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. And he was the chief economist and director of the UN Development Program's International Policy Center for Inclusive Growth in Brazil. And while in Brazil, he also served as economist of the Brazilian Development Bank. And also, he became a consultant to the Welfare and Human Resources Division of the World Bank. Dr. Kakwani's research areas include development of measurement tools needed to evaluate poverty, inequality, and disparity, and to provide guidance and empirical evidence on proper growth, taxation, public policies, human development, and social welfare. He has published more than 100 papers in top leading journals, including Econometrica, and with that, he has actually 9 papers published there. And he is also a advisory board in the Journal of Economic Inequality. And 6 books so far published by reputed publishers like Oxford University Press, Cambridge University Press, and Edward Elgar and Macmillan. And all his papers, Dr. Kakwani's intuitive approach is original and has pioneered empirical evidence in economic development research. I actually prepared 5 pages, so no, just kidding. But due to the interest of time, this one I couldn't miss because his well-known Kakwani Index has been a standard measure for progressivity in taxation, and he was actually awarded the Mahalanobis Gold Medal for outstanding quantitative economics contribution. Most recently, the Journal of Income Distribution brought out a special issue in honor of Dr. Kakwani, and to borrow the editor's words, for his legacy on the study on income inequality, poverty, and taxation progressivity. It's an honor and privilege that we have in the PES conference this afternoon in person, Dr. Nanak Kakwani. Ladies and gentlemen, let us all welcome Professor Dr. Nanak Kakwani.
Okay, maganda hapon po. So let me say at the outset that this conference has been very nicely organized. The plenary sessions, I have attended all plenary sessions. They were very high quality, and I enjoyed them and covering wide range of topics. Now, the theme of the conference, as I see, is transforming the Philippine economy for a prosperous, resilient, and inclusive society. Now, this is a long title, but I summarize it as a sustainable shared prosperity. So that's a short title. I think that matches with this long title of this theme of the conference. So originally, I was not going to talk about shared prosperity, but then when I saw the top title of this theme of this conference, I changed my mind, and then I revised my presentation so that I can focus on shared prosperity. Now, shared prosperity sounds like a very simple idea. If you have two persons, and if you have a cake, if you are dividing among two persons, you know how can they share. But it can become a very complex issue. Shared prosperity is a very complex. I think that yesterday, World Bank representative, he pointed out that the prosperity should be shared widely. And then I raised the issue that shared prosperity you can have, you can measure in infinite number of ways. So how does World Bank defines shared prosperity? But I didn't get very clear idea, the precise idea of what shared prosperity is for the World Bank. So now I will talk about shared prosperity, how this complex issue, we can measure it. And we have to not measure between 1% or 2% or 5%. We have to measure it for the whole country. Philippines has 120 million people, and we want to know whether there's a shared prosperity in Philippines. There has been shared prosperity in Philippines among 120 million people. Or in India, 101.4 billion people, or China, 1.4 billion. So I think we can measure it. The number of the people does not really matter. We can do it, so I will touch upon that. But let me first can we move this? Here, up and up, huh? Okay. Okay, now, first let me tell you briefly what do I mean by shared prosperity. So now, economic growth generates goods and services in the economy, where we may characterize that goods and services, let's call it economic pie, which needs to be enlarged to achieve total prosperity. You know, that we have to have a higher growth. We have to have more goods and services produced in the economy so that we can we can increase the total prosperity. I mean, total prosperity also includes means, you know, that what you get, economic growth provides you means, provides you income, which you can exchange for goods and services in the marketplace and buy goods and services, which enhances your well-being. But also, we can go beyond that, not just the means, you know, the focus on means, but we can also go beyond means and talk about well-being, that the means are generated, but basic idea is that we have to increase the people's well-being, our people's standard of living. So if we have appropriate policy, we can use the means to enhance people's well-being. Now, this is a total prosperity, but pie distribution determines how the population shares the pie. Now, if the pie is shared equitably, we may call it shared prosperity. Very simple definition, that if pie is shared equitably, we call it shared prosperity. So our ultimate social objective is to achieve shared prosperity. Not the total prosperity, but shared prosperity, that how the total prosperity is shared among the people. Now, economists are deeply divided about how we achieved shared prosperity. Now, some believe that we must focus on policies to enlarge the pie first, and then we should have policies to divide the pie among the people equitably. So belief is that expanding the pie size and dividing the pie are two mutually exclusive phenomena. That is what general, perception among economists is, that some talk about we should focus on growth, others talk about focus on the distribution. But we don't subscribe to that view. We believe that two phenomena are growth and its distribution are interrelated, and we have to link them together. They emerge, they come out by the same process. So both happen simultaneously. So these are the two simultaneous outcomes of shared prosperity. Now, so that is a debate about pie. Now in this lecture, because when you are talking about distribution, that total prosperity can be distributed in infinite number of ways, So it becomes very complex, that how you divide the pie, or how do you divide the total prosperity. Now, that's a very difficult question, but development economists, many development practitioners, they have talking about 4 development goals, because linking the total prosperity with the share, how they share, it gives rise to 4 development goals. One, they are proper growth, inclusive growth, comes quite often in discussions, and proper development and inclusive development. So I make the distinction between these 4 development goals. And literature, unfortunately, is very confusing, does not make the distinction between these 4 development goals, but this is what I want to talk about. And then, so this lecture, I define these 4 development goals, and then provide a methodology to operationalize them using the real world data. And then I apply this methodology to see if global growth has been shared, or global prosperity has been equitably shared, or where the globe is having shared prosperity at global level. So I will touch upon that. And also, the methodology which I'll talk about will also provide some sort of a monitoring system, shared prosperity, how to monitor it. Because if that is our social objectives, then we should have a monitoring system to evaluate alternative government policies. The government have many policies, the digitalization, and we talked in all these presentations, many government policies, but what are they achieving, those policies? We can talk about many policies. We say increasing the employment, productive employment, this and that. There are too many policies you can talk about. But policies have to be evaluated in view of some object. And our objective is achieve social shared prosperity. So I will, methodology which I will talk about is how to estimate them, and provide a monitoring system. Now, these 4 goals which I talk about, pro-poor growth, inclusive growth, pro-poor development, and inclusive development, there I see as a 4 characterization of shared prosperity, that how we share the prosperity. So we talk about that. Okay, for instance, when we talk about pro-poor growth, so what we are doing is that we are focusing on only the poor, that we make sure that total prosperity or total output which is generated in the economy, share, the poor get greater, not less share than the rich, than the non-poor. Similarly, inclusive growth, where we talk about broad-based growth, that not only we focus on the poor, but we focus on, we have a broad-based growth focusing on everybody, that everybody should be able to participate in the growth process, and they should benefit from it. But then development is a different concept. So I'll define that development concept. So before that, I want to discuss 2 concepts which are never talked about. One is relative and absolute shared prosperity. What is absolute growth and what is relative growth? These are the 2 concepts which never come into discussions among economists. Dr. Balisakan yesterday in the morning informed in this meeting that Philippines' economic growth has come down from 6% to 5.4%. Right? I mean, you remember that, huh? Now, we call this growth as a relative growth. It is following a relative approach, percentage, that from 6% to 5.4%. So economists understand, most of the economists talk about these growth rates in relative terms. But alternatively, we may also say that, the growth means when you have a growth, economic growth, it generates the means, it generates the income of the people, right? And then people earn the income, but they look at the income, that because it's an income they use in the marketplace to buy goods and services. They exchange goods and services with the income. Then they know that how much additional income they are increasing, or if there is a recession in the economy, how much income they are losing, right? So that concept, so you can measure the growth in absolute terms, that so many, 5,000 pesos of increase in income. Then people know that 5,000 pesos, how much they can buy, additional goods and services. Or if they are losing 5,000 pesos, then see that how much consumption they have to decrease. So that is an absolute growth. So relative growth and absolute growth, 2 are, they are very related, but they can give very opposite results. And economists never talk about, I haven't seen much debate about absolute growth. Let me give you an example. Okay, suppose there are 2 persons, A and B. A has an income of $100, and B has an income of $1,000, 1,000 pesos. Supposing we have a policy that gives $15 to the poor and $105 to the rich, okay? So A gains 15% income, the poor person gets 15% income, and richer person gets 10.5% income. So which means that this policy, which gives $15 to the poor and $105 to the rich, it means that this policy is pro-poor because poor are getting greater percentage of income with this policy, okay? But if you look at the absolute terms, rich are getting $105 and poor are getting only $15. So rich are getting 7 times more income than the poor. And they can buy goods and services 7 times more. They can enjoy a greater standard of living. So you see that in this case, when you use the absolute growth definition, we find that this policy is very anti-poor. It is pro-rich, actually, policy. So you can see the distinction between the two, that relative growth, it gives you quite different results from absolute growth. So how we measure economic growth matters. Almost all economists measure economic growth in relative terms, except me. The absolute concept can also be appealing, as pointed out, that most people may understand the absolute concept better than the relative concept. They tend to understand better how much additional goods and services they can buy with additional income. Similarly, if there is a recession, then people can assess how much consumption of goods and services they have to cut down or sacrifice. So similarly, following this idea, the shared prosperity also depends on what definition you adopt, okay? Whether you adopt relative definition or absolute definition. I mean, this is a very important distinction, and I don't know whether how you like the distinction between the two, how you like absolute growth and relative growth. Now, then this leads me to define what pro-poor growth is. Now, actually, I came to the ADB about 23 years ago. I was appointed as a staff consultant at the ADB in Philippines. That's my first introduction to Philippines. And at that time, ADB were talking about pro-poor growth. And then everybody was talking about it. They were talking about the policies which will promote pro-poor growth, but they did not give precise definition what pro-poor growth is. Then myself and Pernia was also working at the ADB. We wrote a joint paper on what is pro-poor growth, right? So there we defined relative definition, that if relative growth rate is positive, the growth process is pro-poor if it benefits the poor proportionally more than the non-poor, okay? But if growth rate is negative, the growth process is pro-poor if the proportional loss of income from negative growth is less for the poor than for the non-poor, which means that if there's a recession, then the loss of the growth, if poor are suffering less loss than the rich, then it is pro-poor. So this is the basic definition. We wrote a paper on what is pro-poor growth. But in 2008, I wrote a paper with Son, that there we talked about absolute growth, absolute definition of pro-poor growth. A similar idea, instead of relative, the benefits poor get is absolute benefits in income, not the relative definition. So these are the two definitions which are very useful to point out. Now, how to measure, because this is a starting point, that you have to define very clearly, precisely what poor growth is. Not that the policies don't determine, policies once you measure the poor growth, once you define it, if you cannot define it, you cannot measure it, okay? So once we measure it, then we can evaluate the different policies, whether they are achieving poor growth. So in this, what I do is, I use the social welfare function as a tool to solve this problem. I mean, social welfare function, where we can also bring in both total growth rate and also the distribution of benefits of the growth in the social welfare function framework. So I'm using in this lecture these 4 development goals which I talked about. I'm using social welfare framework to define them and to measure them. Okay, now this is the sort of a social welfare function, pro-poor social welfare function, where what we do is that when we are talking about poor, our objective is to reduce the poverty as rapidly as possible, okay, as rapidly. So what we do is we put all the focus on the poor, and we don't care about the non-poor, only we care about the poor. What non-poor are getting, we don't care, okay? So what we do is that social welfare function is kind of a weights you give to individuals. So when we are talking about pro-poor growth, we give all the weights to the poor only, and 0 weight to the non-poor in the social welfare function, okay? So when you have a 0 weights for the non-poor, then we means that society does not care about the non-poor. We are only concerned about the poor, okay? Now, inclusive growth, how it is different from pro-poor growth. I mean, inclusive growth has, a lot of people have talked about inclusive growth. Some countries have adopted inclusive growth as a development agenda. I think a couple of years ago, 2-3 years ago, ADB organized a conference on how to define inclusive growth. And there was an economist, very good economist from Harvard, Clausen. His view was that this concept is very vague, I mean, they could not define what inclusive growth is. But it is important when you are talking about inclusive growth as a development strategy, we must be able to define it. So in contrast to the pro-poor growth, inclusive growth is a broad-based growth, benefiting everyone, not just the poor. So what we do is, in the social welfare function, we give positive weight to everyone in the society, okay? But also we want the equity, because inclusive growth means equitable growth. So what we do is, we give highest weight to the most deprived person in the society, and the weight declines monotonically, and the richest person gets the 0 weight. So this is a strategy which I'm following of inclusive growth. To measure inclusive growth, it has to be broad-based growth. Everybody should participate in the growth process and benefit from this. But the most deprived person should benefit the most. Oh. Okay. So this is the basic definition of inclusive growth. So this is the welfare function in this inclusive growth. So let me, got a message that I have only 5 minutes to. So here I'm talking about the development. Maybe our view of development. What is development? I mean, many countries, for instance, Philippines is growing 6%, so everybody says, oh, Philippines development is very good, If growth is, there's a growth in the economy, then there's a development. But that's not true, because growth generates the means in the economy, right? But how people use these means, to enhance their well-being. I mean, ultimate objective is the well-being. So we define development as a well-being, not just the means. Means is different. The means are means are necessary but insufficient to give people the quality of life they have. So development I see is at the end of the objective, and growth as a means. So that is why I'm making distinction between growth in pro-poor growth or inclusive growth, and generalizing it to inclusive and pro-poor development. Now, idea of Amartya Sen, he was my mentor and teacher at Delhi School of Economics. He said that economic development has to be concerned with kind of people, life kind of people can lead, what they can or cannot do. For example, whether they are able to be well-nourished, get education, are able to escape avoidable morbidity or avoidable deaths. So these are these different indicators of well-being. So I have generalized the social welfare function to the well-being function, and then I can measure same way as pro-poor development, where the poor gets the higher, well-being, and non-poor gets the lower well-being. Similarly, inclusive growth, same way, that the whole society gets the well-being, but the most deprived person, they get the most weight. So let me skip that part, and so let me go to the illustration, quick illustration. Okay, let me go to the quick illustration. What I have done, I have compiled the data for 173 countries over a period of 2000 to 2021 for 2 decades, And I've used the countries as a specific, unit of analysis. So we collect the data. So I have collected as an illustration per capita GDP in 2017 PPP, okay, purchasing power parity. And then other the well-being indicators is life expectancy at birth, infant survival rate, and maternal survival rate. Maternal mortality rate, I have converted it to maternal survival rates. So these are the health indicators, the health outcomes. So you can see that, in the whole world, the relative growth is 202.2% per annum for over the 2 decades. But absolute growth is $286 per year. We have to measure in terms of the income, okay? And similar applies to the life expectancy at birth, which has been growing at the rate of 0.41% per year, average life expectancy at birth, but absolute life expectancy is increasing by 0.29 years, number of years, okay? Absolute means actual number of years. Okay, so let me proceed. Now I want to know whether the global growth, had a shared prosperity or not. So we can see here that pro-poor growth, what the idea is that, what I have got is that if there's a gain in the growth rate, whether of the well-being or income, then it is pro-poor, and if there's a loss, it is anti-poor. Similarly, if there's a gain in growth rate, inclusive growth, gain means growth is inclusive, loss means the growth is non-inclusive. So gain and loss were intuitively, we can understand very quickly. So in this diagram 3, you can see that trend relative proper growth is 1.78%. That's a relative growth. But if you see in the, which means that in the globe, in the world, 173 countries, poorer countries are having higher growth than the non-poor countries. Than rich countries, their growth is lower because in relative terms. But if you come to the next figure, 4, absolute growth is negative in both cases, which means that growth is not shared. In absolute terms, the world growth is not, prosperity in the world is not shared. But if you look at the relative growth, it is shared. Same situation is inclusive growth, that there is a gain in relative inclusive growth, and there's a loss in the relative inclusive growth. But if you look at these development indicators, health indicators, you see that the poorer countries are gaining more. Okay? So this is a way you can calculate and monitor both shared prosperity in terms of absolute and relative terms. So maybe that I think my time is up. I would love to spend some little more time, but cannot. Okay, so we can welcome some questions, and maybe heated debate will be nice.
Please sit here so that you can entertain some questions. Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Kakwani. I'm actually fanboying right now, having seen Dr. Kakwani's papers many times before and used them in my classes as well. So at this point, let's go now to our open forum. Dr. Kakwani will be more than happy to answer your questions. So grab this opportunity to ask your questions to a legendary economist. If you're shy, you can use Slido. So go to slido.com and use the code #PES61 and then put in your questions. And then I have access here on my phone so I can see your questions. Yes, sir. Here it is. Thank you. Okay, so does anyone have any question? The microphones are in the aisle, so please approach them as you please. So maybe I can ask the first question, Dr. Kakwani.
I think it's a very big topic, and I had to finish in 10, 15 minutes. So maybe I may not have explained it very properly because I needed much more time to explain it,
No problem at all.
So if there are no questions, but there's a paper which I have given to the conference, they will upload it, a very detailed paper, and if you have interest in this area, you can read that paper. But I want to just point out that Philippines has a lot of good data. And this methodology which I have developed in the paper can be easily applied to Philippines, And I was thinking about, the digitalization and all this, whether they are. We can also extend this idea whether digitalization is pro-poor or inclusive. You can actually measure it. And many other indicators which are talking about, that health services and health education, and you can extend this whole methodology to a wide range of topics. So I think if some researchers here can take up this methodology and can do a lot of work on this area.
Thank you, Dr. Kakwani. Any questions from the floor? We'll take them right now. Yes, Dr. Mangahas. Microphone, please, for Dr. Mangahas. Please get the pakuhan.
Thank you, thank you. Greetings, Nanak. It's been a very long time since we saw each other last. It's good to have you here. Good to have anybody who does research and compares different groups of people like rich and the poor. I believe in that. I see, however, that you are going to the extent of giving some kind of weights, you know.
Say again,
Can you?
Kindly speak up a bit more, sir.
Louder?
Yes, that's good.
Okay, like that. Okay,
Yes.
yeah, okay. Sure. Sure, I don't want to shout, but I don't mind speaking louder. Okay, let me go directly to the approach that I personally favor now, right? Because I think it's much simpler. And I think we already have the data, and the data are being gathered, not only here, but everywhere, and are much simpler to interpret. And I am thinking about the notion of people getting better off and feeling that they do, or getting worse off and feeling that they do. So this is entirely bottom-up. Bottom-up. This bottom-up approach has been in place since even in 1930s, 40s, 50s, up to now it's happening. Just ask people if they're getting better off or worse off. In fact, now the Banco Central is gotten into the picture, and it has joined in by sponsoring it's in the consumer expectation surveys, whether people are getting better off or worse off. So this approach is simply to compare how many people are getting better off by their own standard, and how many people are getting worse off. And then just comparing the numbers of such people. No more waiting. No more waiting. Just find out first if more are getting better off than are getting worse off. Actually, in human history, most of the time, you will find more people saying they are getting worse off than more people saying they are getting better off. That is more common. In our case, it was like that, indeed, until approximately 2013, when there became at least a tie between the number getting better off and getting worse off. And then from 2013 to about 2019, there was a nicely looking surplus of gainers over losers. Right, okay. So in the first place, to my mind, if you want development, you should have more getting better off than getting worse off. And that's just very democratic counting, you know, numbers versus numbers. No waiting. And then secondly, you try to look at the characteristics of the gainers and the losers. To my mind, the simplest way of comparing them is just to look at their educational attainment. Now, normally, it's very, very correlated to educational attainment. In other words, the highly educated are the biggest gainers and the smallest losers. So that's like saying the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poor. Yes, indeed. But at least there are more getting better off than are getting worse off. Right? And that's how I'm doing it. And we are, you know, Well, it's in place. That's what I want to say. It's in place. It's very, very easy to understand. Well, as long as you express it well. The Banco Central is not explaining it well. No? It has the data, but it's not explaining it well. It's using, obscure kinds of terminology. The simplest terminology is just to count gainers and count losers and then subtract one from the other. And that's what I recommend. Okay, thank you.
Gainers and losers is a good idea. I'm not contradicting you on that. But how much gainers are gaining and how much losers are losing? I mean, that is very important. For instance, economic growth generates, means for people to have a good life, But some people, I mean, they may gain, some is gaining, say, $1 and another is getting $2,000. So that, both are gaining, but that is not acceptable. The gap is so large, can be so large. For instance, there's a big debate in America, 1% against 99%. That's 1% are getting better off, and 90%, 99%, they are not,
Okay, may I comment on that, Nanak?
Yeah.
All right. Trouble there is that income is so difficult to measure that it doesn't get measured.
Yeah.
Right? And that's why I don't want to measure it, because it's too much trouble.
Yeah.
Whereas if you just ask about these gainers, you can immediately get it, and I've got it quarterly. I've got it quarterly for more than 30 years. But measuring income, I think it's emphasized, you see? You need 3 hours interview, and then you're not even sure about what the result is. So I don't recommend it. It's almost a waste of research time to measure income. That's my view. See, and if you want, in other words, if you want to measure how much more people's welfare is, then you use some much simpler things like maybe their consumption of certain items, if you like, level of living things. You can do that, but income, is too academic. It doesn't, translate to actual data on the ground.
Yeah, I understand, because I'm familiar with what you have been doing, for many, many years, doing the surveys and measuring poverty and all that. I mean, that's a very commendable work, right? But ultimately, our policies, we revolve around growth, that we have to generate goods and services in the economy, and whether those goods and services which are generated, whether they are equitably distributed or not, I mean, so I think, both approaches, I'm not dismissing your approach. I mean, that's a very useful approach. Actually, you have kindly sent me the data. I will look at it more if I can connect that with my methodology, Because, we don't have to use income that one is better off than the other. We don't have to use income always, But what you are using is that asking people, whether they are well off or not well off, So that's another way that if we can find out the economic situation, if we can rank the people, But total number, if you ask, the people, say 2 million people are gainers, Yeah, say 2 million are gainers. But gainers, one may gain only $1 and another may gain $100, I mean, that is the issue which is worrying me, that just the number is not enough, how much they are gaining and how much they are losing, I mean, that is, in my view, is important.
Thank you.
So you insist on measuring income?
Yeah, doesn't have to be income. You can,
okay,
you can find out some other way to find out the economic situation.
Or something else.
Yeah, something else. Maybe wealth, that people have.
Okay, and I'm just saying, measure the number of people who are at least gaining, And then secondly, if you want to know how much, then you use some simple indicators of how much, like whether they have this or that. But
I mean, when you
I don't
ask
want to. But I do not. I do not have them compare themselves to other people. No interpersonal comparisons. Only time comparisons. Only now versus the past. That
I
to
mean,
me is
when
the only
you-
thing that matters.
when
Now
you
versus
are-
the past.
when-
No,
when-
no envy anymore.
When you ask people whether they are getting better off or worse off, they have in their mind whether their income is increasing or decreasing, right? I mean, real income. I mean, income comes into their head, maybe head, you know. I mean, we may not be accurately able to measure income, but people have in their mind how much, you know, money they have to go and buy pizza or, you know, buy something from the market, you know. They have to have some notion of income. That is why in my presentation, I introduced the two ideas of growth, you know, the improvement. Growth means improvement, you know, how much gain and all that. So I gave two concepts, you know. One is the relative concept and absolute concept. I want to know your views on that, you know, that, you know, absolute concept to me is very intuitive to me, that people know exactly that they have a, you know, 100 peso, how much they can buy. But if they know that their income has increased by 2% or 5%, they will be confused, you know. They will not have good understanding of how much well off they are becoming, you know. So I mean, these are very complex issues, and we have to, yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Kakwani. Any other questions?
Yeah, Alex.
One very quick question from Al.
Professor Alex.
Dr. Kakwani, you asked me to comment, so very simple. If you use the experience of China, as far as Deng Xiaoping was concerned, he was not concerned with whether the poor will get poorer relative to those who will get richer. The experience is that in a span of 20 years, they were able to lift 600 million people out of poverty. Even if that meant generating 100 billionaires.
Yeah.
As long as the ones in the bottom reach a threshold where they can live a life that is considered not poor.
Yep.
Because the sectors of the economy do not grow at the same time. In geography, there's a dispersion of growth, meaning you cannot really grow equally across sectors, across industries, across age groups, or across provinces. So by definition, if you just have a growth policy that says, lift so many people out of poverty, then that should be good enough. But even if at the expense of what economists would say, a deterioration of the Gini ratio, they don't mind as long as the bottom lifts the bottom of the boat. Thank you.
Okay, I think, I mean, that's an important issue. That is why here I have 4 development goals. Pro-poor growth, inclusive growth, pro-poor development, inclusive. There are 4 distinctions I am making. Now, if you know, you may be that you are more concerned about the poor, then you follow the first development goal. But if you want broad-based growth, everybody benefits, you know, so then we go for inclusive growth, you know. So this is distinction, that's why I'm, you know, the literature does not make that clear distinction between these, you know, distinction between means and ends, you know, I mean, yeah. And about China, they have reduced the poverty, but their growth has been 10 to 12% for almost 35 years, you know. Huge, you know, growth there has been. I mean, maybe that, you know, many millions, you know, people have come out of the absolute poverty, but inequality has increased in China, right? But, okay, I mean, that doesn't matter. But point is that if you put too many resources, you can always reduce poverty, right? I was in China, as you saw my, you know, and there they have a Dibao program. Have you heard of that? The Dibao program, there's a social welfare program. I think you have in Philippines PPP,
4P? 4P? You have a 4P? They have a DBOW program where they are covering 40 million beneficiaries in DBOW program. So DBOW, 40 million, beneficiaries. Then I thought, when I am in visiting China, I should evaluate their program, right? So that particular 2013, they spent about 87 billion yuan on that program. And then I was asking the question, how much was given to the beneficiaries, poor or non-poor, whosoever it is, They came out, the figure came out was only 20 billion. So they are spending 87 billion, and then the beneficiaries are getting only 20 billion. Where is 60 billion going? I kept asking them, that what is happening? If you want to reduce the program, it's a very expensive program. I was calculating the rate of return, social rate of return. It was negative. So China is reducing poverty at a very high cost. So it's not just the reducing poverty, you have to be efficiently reduce poverty, that is what, in your Philippines also, 4 PPP you have to be very careful how you are targeting the people, poor, people, whether you can reduce the poverty or if you can achieve pro-poor growth with minimum of the cost. So cost is very important too. That was I was selling that, and I published that paper in Chinese Economic Review, and which is very widely used, quoted,
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Kakwani. I'm afraid we don't have any more time for your questions, but please feel free to approach Dr. Kakwani after the program if you have more questions to ask. So again, on behalf of the Philippine Economic Society, we thank you very much, Dr. Kakwani, for this very stimulating and timely discussion. A big round of applause for Dr. Kakwani. And now we're calling PS President Randy Tuanyo as well as Dr. Agham Cuevas to give the certificate and token of appreciation to Dr. Kakwani.
Oh, thank you.